Deep into History is independent and proudly listener-supported. To support the show, please go to patreon.com/deepintohistory. I could really use your help. And for everyone who has ever supported my art, I salute you and thank you from the center of my being. This is Deep into History, and I'm your host, Arjun Hundal.
Some history shows merely scratch the surface.
It's one small step for man.
We go a little deeper.
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace.
This is Deep into History. How deep do you want to go?
It is late summer in the year 102 before the Common Era, in the now fully Roman-controlled province of Gallia Narbonensis. A mere 2 days after the legions of Consul Gaius Marius had wiped out the titanic horde of Teutones and Ambrones, led by their high king Teutabad, at what came to be known as the Battle of Aquae Sextiae. Just before the crack of dawn, the consul is shook awake by a page and handed a sealed letter from the Senate. Bleary-eyed, he broke the wax seal and was in a momentary state of utter disbelief as he finished reading the shocking news and request for immediate aid to save the city of Rome itself. For the Senate's letter, though vague and with very few details, stated that Rome's other consular army, which was tasked with holding the Alpine passes in the defense of the north of Italy against the Cimbri, had failed, which implied that in effect, the barbarians were now in control of the province of Cisalpine Gaul and had successfully invaded the Italian mainland, meaning that if they chose to march south immediately, their horde could be at the walls of Rome itself in a mere week. This was an emergency. His army was desperately needed to block any advance, and his exhausted legions were required to engage and destroy the invincible Cimbri and their allies, or the Republic would surely fall. The consul shot up from his bed, ordered his page to bring him his armor, and sent another to call for his officers to attend him immediately in his command tent, and yet another to order his personal signaler to sound the horn, which would initiate a full battle muster of his entire consular army and would cause his men to arm themselves for battle, gather their supplies, assemble into their cohorts, and be prepared to march once their officers returned to them. In mere seconds, the trumpet sounded. And quickly after, trumpets were blaring from signalers stationed around his massive camp, atop the hill, whose steep decline down to the river and the vast plain beyond was covered with the bodies of Teutones, Ambrones, and Teugeni tribesmen, who his legions had vanquished in a wholesale slaughter. As he armed himself, his officers burst into his command tent and stood at attention around Marius's command table, where his pages had already placed maps of Trans and Cisalpine Gaul. As he entered and took his position at the head of the table, he studied the maps intently and used what little information the Senate had provided in the letter to make an educated guess as to where the Cimbri were and where best to position his legions to block the horde's path to the Eternal City. As he considered everything, he realized there were other matters and a major concern to be addressed. That concern being that though they had killed or enslaved the vast majority of the Teutone horde, some 2,000 had escaped. Among them, many lesser kings and high chieftains who, left to their own devices, could potentially rile up local Celtic tribes into open rebellion once his legions had left the province. So first, he ordered the commander of his elite auxiliary Numidian cavalry to track and hunt them down, with orders to kill all commoners, but if possible, capture their nobles. The commander saluted, turned, and ran out of the tent to his men and horses to begin the hunt. Next, Marius pointed to a spot on the map in western Cisalpine Gaul, the north of Italy, and ordered his army to move there at maximum speed. His men were to leave immediately with only vital equipment and enough food to sustain themselves for 2 weeks. He would arrange for fresh supplies to meet them at their destination. The massive treasure that his men had taken as their spoils of war would be assembled onto a relatively few carts pulled by their pack animals into a column under the protection of a cohort of his personal honor guard, while it slowly made its way south to the allied city of Marsilia, modern Marseille, with a letter he had already dictated to a scribe, ordering the city's elders to house, guard, and keep the treasure safe until he called for its release. He explained that without any carts or pack animals, carrying only vital supplies on their poles would allow his legions to march at record speed and be in position as soon as possible. His final order was that their camp was to be burned to the ground as soon as they left, thus leaving no material or the camp itself to be studied by potential enemies to copy and use against Rome. He gave a solemn nod to his officers, and they left to carry out his commands. Ready for battle or whatever awaited him, the consul followed them out of his command tent and found the remainder of his honor guard, now 4,500 heavy cavalry, his killers, had already assembled into a column awaiting him. He mounted his massive white stallion at their head, and with a nod, the nearest gate of the camp was pushed open, and they galloped forth to save the Republic from the Cimbric horde. His honor guard devoured many miles before they reached a river surrounded by grass ideal for grazing. Marius made a fist and raised his right arm, which signaled a halt. As his men and horses ate, drank, and took a few moments to refresh themselves, he looked back in the direction from which they had come and saw that a small but growing black plume of smoke was rising in the distance, which meant that his orders had been carried out exactly as he knew they would. During the ride, he had time to consider the many implications of the vague letter from the Senate, also to contemplate any and all strategies he could use to stop the Cimbri. And as he stood there, watching the smoke plume become a column rising to fill and darken the horizon, the Achilles of the late Republic had a dark thought. If the legions under the command of Rome's junior consul had indeed been wiped out, as all Roman armies who had faced the barbarians had been for more than a decade until his, it stood to reason that his rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who had resigned the high rank of legate he had given him, only to return to Rome and run for and become a military tribune in the army of Consul Catulus, had perished as well. And though he mourned the loss of so many Roman warriors in this, the Republic's most desperate hour, he realized that without his handsome, cunning, and charismatic rival, nothing and no one could prevent him from fulfilling the prophecy he had received as a child, meaning that he was indeed Jupiter's chosen, the instrument of the king of Olympus's will, and he would become consul of Rome 7 times. Gaius Marius ordered his men to remount and ride forth to Rome, and despite the growing blackness caused by the smoke dimming the sun, the consul's eyes gleamed as if infused by bolts of Jupiter's lightning, and he grinned. This is a tale of desperation, the tale of a desperate people who had wandered across Europe in an epic quest to find a new homeland. The tale of a desperate republic drained of manpower, desperately trying to defend its heartland against a foe that had vanquished all armies it had sent against it with such ease that it seemed to its citizens that they had angered the gods and lay under a curse. The tale of an inexperienced junior consul leading Rome's new improved legions against a mighty king who led an army of elite ironclad giant warriors. The saga of Nicopolis' Felix, using all his skills to ensure victory so that he could attain enough power to face his nemesis, who considered himself to be Jupiter's chosen. Rome versus the Cimbri, Rome versus the Tigerini, Rome versus the ferocious Celtic tribes of the Italian Alps, and the opening salvo in a blood feud that would bring the Republic to its knees, dooming it to fall to the Empire. So take a deep breath, let it out slowly. Put some smoke in the air if you choose, and just let your mind flow to my voice as we go deep into the late 2nd century before the Common Era, as we move through the north of Italy with the so seductive Lucius Cornelius Sulla. and experience the titanic Battle of Tridentum in a tale I call versus the Cimbrian War. Welcome back. Marius entered Italy through the western passes of the Italian Alps. As he descended, he dispatched most of his honor guard to the position his legions were already marching towards. And then, with a small party, he rode south, straight to Rome, to get desperately needed information and intelligence so that he could formulate a strategy to defeat the Cimbri. His approach was noticed. Word spread. And as soon as he arrived at the city, passed under the massive gates in its fortified wall, he was met with cheering crowds lining the streets he rode upon. He did not go home to his beloved Julia Maria and their son, but went straight to the Senate. Aware that the consul was approaching, the Senate was fully assembled. As he entered the chamber, he was met by cries of outrage from the more conservative members and his optimate rivals, because he had walked in and took his seat in one of the two curule chairs at the base of the semicircular benches that rose for 6 stories, armed and in full battle armor. In more civilized times, wearing arms and armor in the Holy Senate was akin to sacrilege. However, this was the uncivilized late Republic in a state of emergency. Annoyed, Consul Marius cleared his throat, ordered them to be silenced, and instead tell him what was happening in the north and inform him about the fate of Rome's other consular army. This caused his powerful enemies to double their outrage at this new insult. So he declared that it was the Senate that had asked for him and his legions to perform the extremely difficult task of marching at breakneck speed to block the enemy's path to Rome. And out of respect for their request, honor dictated that he had come as he was, rather than waste precious time visiting the baths to wash, have his skin oiled, and don a freshly pressed toga. Clearly frustrated, his eyes gleamed with a hint of menace as he ran them across the men seated in the chamber, which caused the clamor created by his enemies to lower to venomous murmurs. So in a booming voice, he formally reported that he had led the forces the Senate and people had entrusted to his command to complete and total victory, that in fact every member of this august body should use their platform and their stations as Patronus to spread the word across the Republic that the decades-long terror inspired by the Teutones, Ambrones, and Teugeni warbands no longer existed, that his legions had eliminated fully half of the barbarian threat, had restored the virtus of the Republic, and that the people need no longer fear anything, because the most lethal consular army ever, he had personally reimagined, mercilessly trained and drilled, was even now marching to their defense. This statement did silence the chamber. Then his faction of the Senate burst into applause, soon followed by the rest, for they had all felt the fear, the terror, and all had lost friends or relatives at the hands of the vanquished tribes. One member of his faction stood and yelled that they should award Consul Marius a triumphal parade. Then others stood and began chanting, Teutonicus, 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 meaning that the Senate should award him that ultimate honor of taking that name, a title that would ensure that his virtus echoed throughout eternity, a hero of the Republic forevermore. Marius stood and waved for them all to be seated. He smiled and acknowledged that he was humbled by their offering the highest honor. However, this was no time to celebrate a triumph. As for the title, he reminded the Senate that he had refused the offered name of Numinicus after he had won the Jugurthine War, adding that his deeds alone in service to the Republic, his virtus, would determine if he were remembered at all, and in a gentle tone, said that his wife loved his name and would be vexed with him should he take any other, which caused the entire chamber, friend or foe, to burst out in laughter. So they got down to business. They informed him that the legions of Consul Catulus had indeed lost a major battle in the Alps, though not as yet the war. In fact, as far as they knew, his consular army, having suffered a severe amount of losses, was at least mostly intact and operational somewhere in the Po Valley. and that the Cimbri were now in Italy proper and coming for this new defensive position. This was all they knew, as communication with the legions of the north had been intermittent and sporadic, as the enemy now apparently dominated the province, blocking the paths of would-be messengers. Marius considered this new information and then called for the Senate's official and ultra-detailed map of the province of Cisalpine Gaul to be rolled out on the Senate floor. Then he asked for all senators with knowledge of the campaign to come forth to describe all they knew to him in detail while pointing to it. One by one they came, and he assimilated all this information. As best he could estimate, Consul Catulus had lost perhaps 1/4 of his army in the battle for the Alps, but had managed to withdraw to a second line of defense in the Po Valley, a vast open fertile plain. And given what little information was provided, with the varying and differing accounts, it seemed to him impossible to hold it if the reports of the sheer number of the Cimbri were accurate. The situation was clearly bleak and still an emergency. However, one advantage from the information he had just been given was that the other army was not in fact vanquished, as the Senate's initial letter implied, which bought him precious time to reassess his plan of action with this new critical information. As his legions could move faster than any army in Roman history, he decided he would send out new orders about the position they were to take up, as blocking the path to Rome itself was no longer critical, making a more considered tactical approach available to him. The consul ordered the entire Senate and all senators not to react hysterically and make publicly aware every report they received from the northern legions, but rather to send every bit of information they received from the front, be it official dispatches or letters from family or friends serving there, directly to him so that he could prepare the Republic for what came next. He made it clear that his army could block and counter the Cimbric horde so that Rome would always be safe, but chilled the optimism in the room when he informed them that his legions could not arrive in the central part of northern Italy in time to affect the outcome of what was occurring to the junior consul Catulus' legions in the north. Consul Marius called for scribes to take down his orders to his legions to be relayed by horse messengers to take up a very different position in Cisalpine Gaul, so as to pose a threat to the strategic flank of the Cimbric horde, a position that if the worst happened, would allow them to march and block the path to Rome, but also allowed an array of possibilities to confront the enemy in battle if the worst did not. Many senators, watching the senior consul preparing his war plans before their eyes in his calm and logical manner, completely removed all the outrage, anger, or hatred that had existed when he had first entered, all of it based upon the political clashes from their respective factions, personal animosity, past transgressions, real or imagined, and for just that moment, the Senate, plebeian or noble, populare or optimate, stood united as Romans and trusted that the Achilles of the late Republic would deliver them from this dire threat to all they held dear. Let's leave Consul Marius and the Senate exactly where they are. And before we move our tale forward, let's first take a step back in time, back to the beginning of this year, 102 before the Common Era, in Rome, to set the scene and to get to know Marius's colleague and Sulla's new commander and general, the junior consul of the Republic, Quintus Lutatius Catulus. Just know that for this particular deep into history historical nutshell, little is known about him. So I've constructed his biography with all sources available as best as I can. Quintus Lutatius Catulus came from an originally plebeian family, though through centuries of familial toil, became a very rich one. In fact, they had had one of its own rise to become consul during the First Punic War, but no other member of the family from 220 to 102 BCE had attained the highest office, nor any of the higher positions in the cursus honorum until he had won the consulship in the last election. Thus we can glean that though very rich, his family did not have true power, which in the Republic meant being able to consistently have members elected to high office, and as Patronus, facilitating their clients to do the same. However, he did have one major social advantage. Well, to him at least, since his family had been enrolled in the Senate for more than a century before, he was not a novus homo, a new man like Marius. Thus, he and his family considered and conducted themselves as nobles, though no one else seems to have considered them to be of that class. In terms of his military service during his rise up the Cursus Honorum, all that can be said is that he was not noted by any ancient historian as having campaigned in any war of consequence, nor did any of his actions have any resonance, which heavily implies that he served in quiet areas, or as a military attaché to a Roman governor of a pacified province, plum positions for those wishing never to see combat, available to families rich enough to bribe the right officials to receive them, an ancient resume-building project, if you will, so as to be seen by the public as having served the Republic, yet with no risk of personal injury. Not necessarily false valor, for they had in fact served, but stolen virtus, if you will, for they never served in combat. And if this sounds familiar, it's because it's a tactic that is ubiquitous in politics today. We do know that before winning this last election, he had run to become consul 3 times in the years 106, 105, and 104, losing each time. These campaigns were very expensive and even more embarrassing to lose. Given that the populares were ascendant and anyone who was not an optimate had an inherent advantage with the rise of Marius, we can glean that he was not particularly charismatic. It appears that his personal conduct in his dealings, acting as if he were noble from one of the founding families of the Republic, had alienated him from both major factions. But by spending fortunes on these elections, he did gain one thing: name recognition amongst the populace. It also appears that during his previous embarrassing campaigns for the consulship, he did not receive the coveted support from Gaius Marius, and more importantly, his wife Julia Maria, who seemed to have only grudgingly given their massive popularity faction support to him in this last election, only to prevent the junior consulship of the Republic from being won by an optimate candidate from an enemy faction. Catulus knew this, and within him brewed a deep resentment towards Marius and the Marians. As we shall see, he fit in neither political world, either of the populares or the optimates. However, since the populares represented the unwashed masses and the optimates represented the rich, being rich himself, he aligned himself with them. Thus, it must have seemed serendipitous, because in the same election that had gained him his coveted first consulship, he also witnessed the election of the recent legate of Marius's legions, who resigned his high rank and returned to Rome to run for the first step up the Cursus Honorum, and easily won the rank of military tribune. One Lucius Cornelius Sulla. You and I know that verses is a labor of love and requires so much research, along with constant writing and rewriting of scripts, that it has quite literally changed the trajectory of my podcast. Early on, it was a reliable monthly hit with a perhaps 45-minute long episode, delivering you the saga of how the Republic fell to the Empire has become all-consuming, with episodes that have ranged as much as 4 hours. Recall the original, full-length The Curse of Apollo's Gold. And while the industry has changed, I have not. I will rise or fall as your lore master. I say this because, in all of my vast research, particularly on the Jugurthine War, there is one historical figure who I came to adore and had never known about before. That is the Ajax of the late Republic, Praetor Aulus Manlius. Apart from his military feats during the war, little else is known about him. Fragments of fragments, but I do know when he disappears from history. And given his relationship to Marius and Sulla, a brotherly and almost familial bond with both men, that served as the last true link between them. I decided to take a few educated guesses, and indeed minor liberties, in order to deliver you an account of his death and how it was, in fact, a major factor in the blood feud that became Marius versus Sulla. Consider what we experienced in the next few minutes. An ode to the virtues of one of the most unsung warriors in all of human history.
Back to our tale.
We know Sulla resigned his rank towards the end of the most dangerous covert mission in ancient history, where Sertorius served as the infiltrator, Sulla, the negotiator, and Aulus Manlius, the enforcer, tasked with approaching the rebellious tribes of southern Gaul to flip them back to the Republic's side or allow them to buy their neutrality and salvation from Rome's wrath by providing intelligence on anything they heard about the movements of the Cimbri and Teutones. They were so successful that after winning back all the tribes of Gallia Narbonensis, the trio's last mission together was a risky approach to a major tribe well beyond the borders of the Roman province, whose power and influence reached all the way to the Pyrenees Mountains through subordinate tribes who owed them allegiance. This was most likely a confederation under the leadership of the Aquitani tribe, near the modern border of France and Spain. The mission unfolded like all the rest, until when Sulla and Manlius, who had gone native over the past 2 years, growing out their hair and beards, adopting Gallic garb and arms to blend in and not draw attention, so that they literally appeared as Celtic warriors, yet when they revealed themselves to be emissaries of the Republic of Rome, at a quiet meeting with the chieftains, as was common practice, arranged by Sertorius, this time, in response, they were suddenly attacked. It was an ambush. Aulus Manlius pulled his massive Gallic broadsword slung across his back, and Sulla drew his longsword from its scabbard and fought for their lives. The duo slew all who attacked them, which is to say everyone they could reach, but there were so many at the meeting that some got away and raised an alarm. So the pair attempted to flee out of the village, but were met by swarms of previously concealed warriors. However, what the tribal assassins failed to realize was that these were not mere Roman senators or soft and overfed noblemen whose heads they could easily take to present to the Cimbri as a sign of their allegiance when they returned. Instead, they were facing the most dangerous warriors of the late Republic, whose skill and virtus already approached that of the Achilles of Rome. Manlius and Sulla cut down all who stood against them as they made their way back the way they had come, hoping to reach their small group of bodyguards, veterans of the Jugurthine War, who lay concealed in the forest not far away. Yet even once out of the village, the trail of bodies they had left in their wake made them easy to follow, and as they ran, bursting out from thickets of trees, came ever more Celtic warriors. But they did not slow the duo down, as if they were in fact the legends of the Age of Heroes reborn. Ajax and Hector. Instead of dueling rivals, were fighting side to side and back to back. None could stand against them. When they finally reached the small clearing where they had left their loyal men, exhausted, wounded, and finally allowing themselves to feel the slightest hint of speas,
Hope.
that their brothers in arms, who had protected them since their clandestine mission to end the war in Numidia, would prove to be their salvation, only to find their bodies hacked to pieces and their supplies and horses gone. The pair had no time to be revolted at the sight or what it meant, for from the trees came an unending stream of new tribal assassins, a flood so great that the giant could barely hold them off, a circumstance that he had never thought possible, even during the most desperate moment of the titanic Second Battle of Cirta, where he had held the line to inspire his thousands of light infantry to keep fighting. Sulla lethally slashed with his Celtic longsword, the previously foreign weapon natural after 2 years of relentless practice against his giant friend and brother. But as the flood of Celtic assassins was about to become a tsunami that would surround and kill them both, Aulus Manlius bellowed for Sulla to run and warned Marius and the Republic of this treachery. Sulla did not move, always needing to breathe to consider the implications of any decision. Manlius bellowed, "Now!" For the first time ever, using the authority of his higher rank, the command so definite and indeed primal that Sulla obeyed. He ran through the narrow gap in the circle of enemies that was about to surround them. Aulus followed for a few steps and suddenly turned back to block any pursuit of his friend. Minutes later, out of breath, Sulla was forced to stop. He looked back through the trees, where he witnessed the Ajax of the late Republic, already bleeding from several wounds, standing his ground, having decimated a dozen tribal champions who tried to follow him. Utterly exhausted, breathing heavily, with none of the Celtic warriors wishing to face him alone. So he watched as the Celts waited until they had him surrounded and attacked from all sides at once, the foe finally gaining the courage to face his brother with 20 of their own. He was speared, cut by long swords. His body turned red by the sheer amount of blood pouring from his wounds. He finally collapsed to the ground, and the barbarians cut his body to pieces. As Aulus Manlius passed onto what comes next, though Sulla wished nothing more than to drop to his knees and bellow a wail of the deepest grief and an ode to his brother's virtue so loud that the gods in Olympus would hear it, he could not. To honor his brother's sacrifice to save his life, he turned and ran, only stopping once he was sure he had not been followed, to collapse into a dreamless sleep. The time during his escape through the trees had allowed him to consider and process the magnitude of what had just happened. Due to recent tensions and a complete lack of direct communication between Marius and himself, two titanic egos, and at best, nominal rivals, Sulla, sickened by the death of their mutual close friend, suspected that Marius had ordered Sertorius, his man, to arrange this trap where he was to be assassinated. His rage and sense of betrayal were made apparent by his next actions. After escaping, Sulla did not return to Marius's fortress and base. Instead, he made his way straight back to Rome as fast as he could, where he resigned his position as legate, general of a single legion in Marius's army, to run and win the position of military tribune, and requested to serve in the consular army of Catulus. The Republic's second consular army was roughly the same size as Marius's. 2 full legions of the new uniformly armored and equipped heavy infantry, each legion accompanied by an oversized companion ala consisting of a mix of troops from across the Republic and units from client kingdoms. A force approaching 40,000 men, though not as well drilled or disciplined. As stated, Catulus was not a skilled general, or particularly well-read or informed on military strategy. However, what he was at least nominally skilled at was recognizing talent in his junior officers and delegating them some responsibilities, especially if they came from powerful families. With his army fully assembled on the field of the war god outside the city walls, he spoke with all of his officers individually. He was intrigued when military tribune Sulla read the new consul in on the details of his recent top-secret mission. Catulus and the rest of the Republic was now well aware of Sulla's diplomatic skills he used to help win the Jugurthine War and earn King Bocchus of Mauritania as his sole client. With this new information on the diplomatic feats he had achieved on behalf of Marius in Gaul, he asked Sulla if he would be willing to lead a similar mission on his behalf. In this case, Tribune Sulla would have to win the allegiance of the never-friendly, though nominally subordinate to the Republic, Celtic tribes of the Italian Alps. For context, Many of these tribes had joined Hannibal and to agree replenish the horrific losses his army had suffered after they crossed the Alps a century before and served him with fanatical loyalty throughout the Second Punic War in Italy. Such was the spirit of independence and hatreds of the Romans that flowed through these powerful tribes. Sulla considered and came to the conclusion that this new dangerous mission would allow him to definitively establish his virtus with any doubters, because Marius would have nothing to do with it. So he agreed, and in a scene reminiscent of one mere years before, he assembled a small escort to act as bodyguards, scouts, and messengers, and with them rode hard towards the north. Ahead of the legions, on this new secret diplomatic mission, let's take a few moments to explore the quasi-province of Cisalpine Gaul, so we can understand its peoples, geography, and get a feel for the region Sulla and Consul Catulus' legions were marching into. Cisalpine Gaul means Gaul on this side of the Alps, meaning our side, the Republic's side, the northernmost part of modern Italy. It is often simply referred to as the Po Valley, because its southern border is the mighty Po River. The largest in Italy, with many others running down, fed by the glaciers on the Alps to the north. The result being that the region's land was among the most fertile in Europe, attracting many peoples over the centuries, and was the northern half of the Etruscan civilization's lands that predated Rome's founding by centuries. The landmass's easternmost extent is washed by the waves of the Adriatic Sea, and in the west, it borders the lands of the Ligurians. Over the century, major Celtic tribes, chief among them the Boii, had invaded through the passes of the Alps and seized much of the region for themselves. They mingled with the Ligurians, meaning they traded, dated, and married, forming a people which the Ligurians called the Ambrones, who they considered themselves to be a part of. While under Celtic control, the region served as a safe entry point for major Celtic warbands to come south from Gaul and raid Italy, which most famously resulted in the sacking of Rome by Brennus and his Senones in 390 before the Common Era. After the Second Punic War, the Republic took a murderous revenge on the tribes that had joined Hannibal and put the rest under a brutal repression. Thus, the Celtic tribes of the region were thought to be ready for any chance to make the Republic pay, and no greater chance had existed than the nearing Cimbric horde, which is why Sulla's mission desperately needed to succeed. Junior Consul Catulus' legions crossed the River Po into the region in the late winter and advanced past the River Adige, which flowed across more or less the center of the province. While he considered his options for the defense of Italy, by all reports he had received, the Cimbri, seemingly immune to the effects of the cold and snow of winter, a time any other enemy would stop and make camp, were approaching quickly and would be close to the mouths of the Alpine passes on the other side of the Alps by early spring. There were 3 major passes known to the Romans, at least 3 wide enough for the massive wagons of the enemy to pass through. Now, the few sources available to us differ drastically on his defensive strategy, the timing of events, and indeed the amount of time in which events unfolded. By using all we have learned about Marius' reaction to them, while his legions were facing the Teutones, culminating in the Battle of Aquae Sextiae in August, which we experienced in our last tale, coupled with the extensive amount of research I have done on this era, I wove the ancient and modern sources into a sequence I consider most likely to be true, and divided them into a 3-phase timeline, through which we will experience the Republic's junior consul's struggle to halt King Boiorix's unstoppable horde's imminent invasion. For if the consul's legions failed, they would all be killed in battle or sacrificed by the sadistic hands of the fabled witches of the Cimbri, leaving the path open so the barbarians could be at the walls of Rome itself in a mere week. So prepare yourself to experience the epic conflict, which history has come to call the Battle of Tridentum, because it most likely went something like this. Ready? Then let's go.
Phase 1.
Late winter to late spring of the year 102 before the Common Era in Cisalpine Gaul, military tribune Lucius Cornelius Sulla is deep into his secret mission to win over the Celtic tribes of the region. He was by far the most experienced and not only tactically but strategically gifted battlefield officer under the command of Consul Catulus, meaning he is away, unable to offer his expertise as to how to best defend the province from the oncoming menace. Thus, the military experienced and at best unremarkable Catulus had subordinates who were vastly less knowledgeable to rely on for advice to plan his campaign. Worse, given his shortcomings, he could not easily discern what advice offered by his officers was in fact good advice. Always a social climber, and with his current political leanings towards the Optimates due to his grudge against Marius for not supporting him in his previous failed elections, he was inclined to listen to those officers who came from noble families, many of whom were dreaded fail sons of the late Republic, those whose families' wealth had bought them their positions. This obscene wealth allowed them to exist in an elite societal bubble their entire lives, where they thought that they achieved high rank through merit, which may explain the consul's first proverbial chess move to defend the province, because he decided to divide his consular army, keeping half of it in the north-central Po Valley, and split the rest into 3 groups. Each of these were to be dispatched into one of the 3 major passes through the Alps, with enough lumber to construct a wall with a palisade running across each. The idea being that the Cimbri, who were erroneously thought to have no ability to assault basic fortifications, would suffer terrible losses trying to scale any of these 3 walls, while his ranged auxiliaries rained down arrows and javelins upon them, with his heavy infantry ready to stab any who attempted to scale the walls. Then, once he knew which pass they were using, or indeed if the massive horde had to use all 3 passes to get across, the other half of his army he kept in the Alpine foothills in reserve, would send cohorts to reinforce each position. For though the passes were wide as passes through the Italian Alps went, the Cimbri would not be able to bring their full force to bear on his defenders in the confines. The plan being that the advanced forces need only hold them until reinforcements arrived, and his legions would repulse them, forcing the horde to retreat back to the north, fulfilling his mandate to prevent an incursion into Italy. So it was that the Republic's second consular army, already vastly outnumbered by the enemy, was split into even more numerically inferior elements and marched to fortify the passes. Sometime later, Tribune Sulla returned to the consul at his Alpine base camp. His approach was noticed immediately from the walls because the small escort he had set out with was accompanied by an inexplicably large train of wagons. The gates were thrown open, and Tribune Sulla rode ahead of his column to inform the consul that he had secured the allegiance of all the major tribes of the northern Po Valley. He went on to explain that his vast caravan was full of wagons bursting at the seams with foodstuffs, which he had personally overpaid for as a gesture of goodwill to the tribes, and that he was gifting 3/4 of it to the consul's army. As for the other quarter, and why this food was critical, allow me to elaborate for a moment. Recall that during the earliest stages of the Marian reforms, the slaves of Sicily, who made up nearly 70% of the population of the island, which functioned as an agrarian breadbasket for Rome itself and the urban centers of all of Italy, had revolted against their oppressors because they believed that Marius's dictate that all provincial and subjects from client kingdoms who had been enslaved by Roman tax farmers when they could not pay their taxes in time were to be freed immediately to address the manpower crisis the Republic was facing after a decade of deadly defeats in the north. The slaves, who in a game of ancient broken telephone interpreted it to mean that Marius had emancipated them all. And when only a few hundred of the hundreds of thousands of slaves were freed, they rose up to slay their oppressors. The revolt was catastrophic, resulting in what history would come to call the Second Servile War. In material terms, it meant that food was now rationed in Rome, and all access that Sicily's bounty would have provided to the rest of Italy no longer existed. This meant that even the legions were sustaining themselves on a strictly limited daily diet. And if there was a poor harvest in Italy, whose farmland could not be properly tended to because slaves were no longer trusted, and every able-bodied male was required to serve in the legions in this critical moment, societal, let alone logistical military supplies were critically low. Even now, with Proconsul Rutilius Rufus successfully leading an extremely undermanned legion to retake the island, the slaves fought back relentlessly in a campaign so bloody that Sicily was quickly turning into a garden of bones, depopulated to such an extent that it looked like the citizens of the mainland republic would have to limit their caloric intake for years. Military tribune Sulla, returning with his vast bounty of food from the now allied tribes, gave the consul's legions more than enough to feed themselves fully for the entire campaign, as well as extra to send to walled Roman towns nearby, which would guarantee their loyalty. As for that extra 1/4 that I spoke of, Sulla, being Sulla, dispatched it to Marius's legions at their base, the massive fortress at the confluence of the Rhone and Isere rivers in southern Gallia Narbonensis. Each wagon was marked with the words, and every driver was given a letter to read aloud and hand over once they arrived. It said, "Courtesy of Lucius Cornelius Sulla." Note: it appears that Consul Marius was away conducting politics with senators who rode to meet him in Liguria with pressing business of state. When he returned, he was greatly annoyed by his adversary's stunt, but his temper was held in check as his legions had been receiving tribute in the form of foodstuffs from the local tribes and towns of southern Gaul, thus were fully fed and well supplied. So he sent Sulla's gift to be sold in the nearby glorious port city of Marsilia. And once the transaction was complete, he split the proceeds among his legionaries, boosting their morale and their personal loyalty to him. I thought you'd enjoy this story to display in practice that their rivalry, though intense, still had a humorous element about it. However, for the legions of Consul Catulus, the supplies were most welcome, needed, and provided a huge morale boost, as the consul could clearly hear the cheers of his men outside his command tent as he listened to Sulla's report. Overjoyed by his military tribune's success in winning over the northern Celts, who lived in the valleys of the foothills of the Alps and in the plains directly south, on the spot, Catulus awarded him with a battlefield promotion to the rank of legate, with limited imperium and the right to command a single legion while serving in his consular army, restoring the rank Sulla had resigned mere months before while serving under Marius. The consul then inquired what his new general would need to win the allegiance of the critically important Alpine Celtic tribes, who, because they literally lived on the mountains, knew every inch of them, were surely aware of secret paths through them, and could potentially give that critical intelligence to the Cimbri, which could potentially allow their warriors to use these unknown routes to get around his defenders in the passes and seal them in. Here, Legate Sulla warned him from the intelligence he had gathered from the Valley Celtic tribes he had won over, that the task of winning over the Alpine Celts in time to stop the Cimbri would be extremely difficult. They would be difficult to physically reach, difficult to convince, as they always had been treated as potential traitors or suspect at best by the Republic, and most difficult because he had been informed by their new allies that there were more than a few powerful mountain tribes who would never negotiate with them, which meant they would have to be quickly and quietly pacified. The look he gave and the emphasis on the words quickly and quietly seemed to have no effect on the consul, because he declared that 4 cohorts were to be assembled to be commanded and led by his new legate for the mission. Far too many for the task at hand in the narrow high passes. Sulla, knowing this would mean failure, and had learned to use his looks, intelligence, and noble status to maximum advantage, chose not to raise an objection to the order because he barely knew this abject social climber. So he changed the subject and instead asked his consul to detail his plan to defend the province. Gesturing to the maps spread across the command table, Catulus almost gleefully detailed it all, as if looking for approval. Sulla, who had served under one of the greatest generals Rome ever produced, and despite their personal and political differences, in war he had learned from and deeply respected the tactical wisdom of Marius. While he had ridden in, he had noted the rather flimsy construction of Consul Catulus' camp, which caused him to have little confidence that the walls and the passes would hold. A strategy he would never have recommended, and had he been present, he would have verbally insulted the officer who had convinced Catulus that this was the best strategy. And realizing it was already too late to alter tactics drastically, he gently suggested that his consul may want to consolidate his army, mentioning the vast numerical superiority of the Cimbri, and that if his mission were to fail, their numbers would be bolstered drastically by the Alpine tribes. He complimented the consul's commitment of not giving an inch of Italian soil to the enemy, then suggested that he should block the exits of the passes with solid walls of heavy timber, overlooked by towers and platforms of ranged units and artillery, then establish 3 Marian-style fortresses just beyond, so even if they broke through, the enemy would have to face an even more concentrated barrage from the far greater number of forces he could place on their walls. Then, he could use his cavalry to attack the barbarians in their flanks, potentially allowing each position to wipe out 1/3 of the enemy threat. The consul took a moment to consider, and Sulla hoped he had reached him in order to salvage the terrible deployment of the army as it stood, but he had erred. Mentioning Marius was a mistake, the consul shook his head. So in order to salvage the situation, it would be up to him. His mission had to succeed. Sulla changed tactics, pointing out that 4 cohorts missing from his camp, 1/4 of the relief force, who would be needed to reinforce the walls when the Cimbri came, could well mean defeat for the legionaries holding the passes, and indeed for the rest of the army. He added that leading 920 heavy infantry into the narrow passes of the mountains would actually hinder his ability to be successful at his mission. So many Romans would be instantly noticed and look like an invading army to the Alpine tribes, thus making them instantly hostile. Instead, he asked his consul for leave to recruit a single cohort from the legions and allies, from men that had experience fighting on or grew up in mountainous terrain. He assured Catulus that this group would be enough for him to lead against any tribe that refused to engage in actual diplomacy and secure an agreement for peace and alliance. He tried to make him understand that a small elite force could be concealed, or at least go largely unnoticed in the smaller Alpine passes against hostile tribes until it was too late. Sulla assured him that he would screen each man personally, making sure everyone knew how to use the terrain, were physically fit enough to handle the Alpine peaks, and that he was sure he could trust to follow his orders exactly in battle when the time came. The consul again shook his head and ordered his new legate to take 2 full cohorts of legionaries and a similar number of support troops from his companion allies, a force of 2,000, and because it was an order, with no choice but to accept it, Sulla led his small army into the Italian Alps. All we know of this part of his now not-so-clandestine mission is that the large number of troops served to slow down his progress through the Alps greatly. While he was successful at winning over a few of the Alpine tribes and secured the neutrality of a few others through diplomacy, as he had predicted, the larger and more belligerent tribes did indeed spot his miniature army as it approached and took their presence as an aggressive and coercive threat. These Celts never trusted the Republic, and when Sulla's messengers arrived in advance asking for a meeting between himself and their chieftains, offering generous gifts and the gratitude of Rome for their aid against the Cimbri, These offers were interpreted as a trick to draw them close to the Romans. No matter how sensibly or eloquently stated, the tribes heard the message: side with the Romans or face immediate violence by the army that had already invaded their lands and be exterminated.
Join us or die.
The result was that Sulla's mini army had to fight pitched battles in the narrow passes of the High Alps and had to wipe out or capture all members of each tribe for fear of them escaping to warn others, or worse, rush north to join the oncoming barbarian horde and show them secret paths through the mountains. This brutal combat slowed down his progress even more, and he was unable to reach the tribes further away. The result? Well, we shall see. For the Cimbri and their allies had reached the northern foothills of the Italian Alps with shocking speed. They had moved their massive caravan, which housed their society throughout the winter, the bitter cold unable to halt their progress, as if the promise of their gods that at last they had found their promised land, a new home, lit a fire in their souls that kept them warm no matter how harsh the weather conditions. When his horde of at least 300,000 people arrived just beyond the borders of the lands of the Celtic tribes of the Northern Alps, High King Boiorix was approached by a group of local chieftains to discover his intent. The horde was so massive, the ironclad giant Cimbri warriors so impressive, so intimidating, and given the fact that these chieftains had had no word from the Republic that it would support them in resisting, due to Sulla's stunted progress through the Alps, they felt they had no other option other than to aid the Cimbri through their mountains as quickly as possible, wishing to get rid of this potential menace that could wipe them out at will. So they gave King Boiorix all the information and intelligence he could have ever dreamed of receiving. They told him of the defensive walls the Romans had constructed across the 3 major passes large enough to accommodate his huge multi-storied wagons in his train, and his 15,000 heavy cavalry, whose large war horses required a relatively even path so as not to be injured. Then, critically, he was informed that the Celts knew of narrow paths only known to themselves that would allow his warriors to circumvent the defenses and reach the Po Valley beyond. Then his people could follow, but they would have to leave their wagons and horses behind. King Boiorix had no desire to separate his army, let alone his people, so he asked many questions about the Roman fortifications, the hidden paths, the mountains immediately around each, and the numbers of legionaries at each.
Then,
once mentally familiar with the landscape, he inquired if the Celts knew of paths unknown to the Romans, however narrow, steep, or high up upon the snowy and icy cliffs that could allow even a small number of his warriors to get just beyond each of the walls and look down upon them, informing the Celts that the relative height above the enemy was not to be a consideration. At this, the chieftains hesitated, clearly needing a proverbial carrot to betray the Republic to such a degree. The High King smiled and said that in return for this information, once his tribes vanquished the legions of Rome and were in control of their new homeland, their tribes would have complete autonomy, never be asked to pay taxes or tribute, and he guaranteed that their youth would not be called upon to serve in his army. And then he swore that they would have the friendship and brotherhood of the Cimbri forevermore. Elated, the Celtic chieftains told him everything he needed to hear. Then, King Boiorix formulated his plan to destroy the Roman legions blocking his people's path into Italy. So it was that he organized 3/4 of his heavy infantry into vanguards, followed by his cavalry, and then his wagon train, which housed their civilization, into 3 separate columns to set out at specific times of departure down each of the passes the Romans guarded. And upon his order, the massive horde split. As for the remaining 1/4 of his elite warriors, a force approaching 30,000, he split into 6 groups, each led by local Celtic guides his new allies had sent him, and each of the groups set off and entered the rough, rocky, and narrow paths and began their ascent. These secret ways quickly became so narrow that the columns of ironclad giants had to march single file, and at points, with their massive swords, large shields, and heavy armor, would have to turn sideways simply to pass through. At some point, each of the 6 groups had to discard their chainmail armor, as it was too heavy and their bulk hindered their progress. The secret ways took them so high up into the mountains that soon they were walking on literal ice, with the sharpest points of rocks from the ground that breached the ice layer. Their only hope of something to brace against, grip, or stand on to move forward at all. These paths were so treacherous that I have no doubt that some of the Cimbri chieftains, who were in command of each of these columns, suspected that the Celtic guides had betrayed them and were leading them to their doom. Cimbri warriors slipped, fell, and suffered horrific injuries like ankles broken in half, torn muscle, and only skin holding them together. And in some cases, much worse, their mission required that even the wounded who could be saved to be left behind, because they had to be in position exactly when their people in the 3 main columns appeared before the Roman walls. They took a murderous toll, akin to that suffered by Hannibal's army a century before. Yet despite the horrific conditions and heartache, they persevered and reached the position their king had ordered them to at the exact moment required. An incredible feat.
Thus,
From their precipitous high vantage, the 6 separate clandestine Cimbri armies watched the respective 3 columns of their tribe approach each Roman wall. As to what they saw, I'm forced to remind you that Consul Catulus was no Gaius Marius. His legions were not as well drilled or trained, and as he was militarily rather inexperienced, these fortifications would have been more or less the pre-Marian reform standard wall of a legionary camp, meaning a single wooden wall roughly 14 feet high of linked tree trunks with a relatively narrow palisade from which the defenders could repulse the enemy with ranged or melee attacks, with the few Roman towers rising, whereas team wielding a single scorpion and perhaps a dozen archers could fire upon any who dared attack them from their relatively great heights. Across the palisade would be first his ranged units, backed up by his heavy infantry, legionaries. Also consider that these passes were in the mountains, meaning beyond a foot of dirt, the ground was solid rock. Thus there were no ditches before the walls, nor a mound of earth created by digging them to serve as obstacles. Worse, because the tree trunks were not well grounded, they were held together with rope. And as each respective Cimbric column approached, the Roman defenders witnessed a similar scene. The Cimbri stopped just outside of missile range from the walls and towers, drew their long swords, and began clattering them against their shields. And began a rhythmic chant of war, and their warriors watching from above knew it was time. With the Romans focused entirely on the enemy in front of them, the 6 Alpine contingents of the Cimbri attacked. You may be asking yourself just questions, like what or how? Allow me to explain. These Cimbric warriors were so contemptuous of the enemy and committed to obeying their king's commands that they had endured the severe cold without any clothing, made their way up through the ice and deep snow to their launching points, and from there, they put their shields under them, trusting that their druids' message from their gods that their promised land was close at hand. They let themselves go and slid down the snow and ice-covered, uneven, and deeply fissured cliffs of solid rock on their ancient makeshift toboggans and boogie boards, with the massive columns of Cimbric warriors in front of the Romans on their walls, seemingly preparing to attack. The first indication of any threat to their flanks and rear would have been the sound and then sight of barbarians who slid off the uneven cliffs and fell to their deaths, splattering on the ground. The Romans had no time to process this insane spectacle because many other enemies followed. who descended successfully. These Cimbri warriors picked up their shields, drew their swords, bellowed war cries, and charged. The surreal sight of unarmored, near-naked barbarian warriors suddenly in their rear, only to look up on the heights flanking their positions, suddenly realizing that thousands more were descending, caused utter panic. All three walls were abandoned, and the three separate groups of the single legion suffered many casualties in retreat from the constant stream of screaming barbarians sledding down the mountain and into their unorganized ranks while they were running for their lives. The naked Cimbri formed into assault squads, killed many Romans, and took many more prisoner, but did not pursue those that escaped their insane Alpine assault. Instead, they waited as their kinsmen in the columns used hook ropes to pull down the Roman walls, blocking the passes, while they herded their prisoners together into groups. It was not long before they heard loud creaks and then resounding crashes as the fortifications were pulled down. The lumber from the walls that were supposed to defend the Republic was instead used for fires to warm their enemies, and the rest to construct altars to which the prisoners were led. And there, in thanks to their gods, and to determine their future will, they were sacrificed by their druids, the witches of the Cimbri. The horde celebrated and rested in their respective passes that night. And it appears that they remained in the mountains for at least a week, as their massive two-storied wagons that housed their civilization had difficulty moving up the icy ground on the passes. The surviving Roman defenders of the walls, once out of the mountains, due to the complete disarray of their retreat, had split into groups as small as a dozen, many becoming lost as they made their way through the dense pine forests of the foothills, began to slowly trickle into Consul Catulus' camp, which is when he first learned of the catastrophe. Beyond the humiliation of the defeat, much worse for him and his entire consular army occurred when the survivors spoke of what they had witnessed in combat to their comrades in camp. As their news passed on from legionary to legionary, it grew from a factual account of the real tactical brilliance of King Boiorix and the bravery of the warriors he sent through the narrow passes high in the Alps, into tales of the Roman defenders being descended upon by bloodthirsty fanatical giants. The innate fear these young legionaries already felt about the oncoming menace, having grown up in the previous decade of northern barbarian dominance over the legions, had made it innate, and was suddenly reignited by the tales, and they remembered their parents, relatives, and friends weeping at the deaths of the previous two generations that had been wiped out by these same barbarians when they were children. Morale plummeted once he came to terms with the fact that his strategy to protect Italy had utterly failed. Consul Catulus needed a new plan. All he had to go on from these various reports was that the Cimbri could emerge from the dense forest all around his camp at any moment and surround the legions. He decided to wait for 3 days while he consulted with his officers to allow more and more groups of survivors to arrive. During that time, so many small groups arrived that it became clear that the defeat was not as catastrophic as he'd first thought. Though the legion he had split and the ranged auxiliaries he had sent had taken at least 2,500 casualties, they could be reconstituted into a relatively intact fighting force.
Then,
a lone, exhausted, starving, and scarred messenger came bearing a sealed message from Legate Sulla. It informed the consul that he, leading the men under his command, had subdued many Alpine tribes without suffering many losses of their own. However, with the Cimbri's arrival, they would have to seek paths out of the mountains to avoid them, which would require them to march in a wide arc and meant that the safest place to rendezvous would be at the river Adige, whose course he would follow back to rejoin the legions if he could escape the mountains. Still with no concrete plan, The consul consulted his maps and realized that this was the perfect option. The River Adige, the second major river in the province, which in essence split it in half, which he and all his men were familiar with, as they had waded across it to reach the north. He decided to move his legions to a position near the village of Tridentum and dispatch a cohort to build a solid and fortified bridge across the river to allow relatively easy resupply and communication with Rome, and if the worst occurred and he was overwhelmed, would allow his army to retreat across the bridge in an orderly manner. Thus, with his men fearing that the Cimbri would be upon them at any moment, he ordered his legions to march south, abandoning his camp. He wrote a letter, which was dispatched to the Senate, to describe the withdrawal as a tactical retreat. Thrilled to leave the confines of the heavily wooded pass, his legionaries marched, perhaps the consul's most wise move, as within a few days, the Cimbri came out of the passes of the Alps and soon reassembled their horde and reunited their tribe in the general area of the abandoned Roman Alpine camp. Wise, experienced, and cautious, High King Beorix ordered the Teugeni tribe, the Helvetic raiders who had marched forth from what is now Switzerland, with their allies the Tigerini, to raid and pillage in the wake of the rampage across the borders of the Republic that the Cimbri, Teutones, and Hambrones had executed, to remain in the area and secure the major passes through the Alps, as well as to ensure that none of the local Celtic tribes would dare move against them or collaborate with their enemy. He then sent emissaries to the local Celtic tribes in the foothills on this side of the Alps and received messages from their chieftains that informed him that they welcomed the Cimbri, but would not dare risk the wrath of the children of the war god, Rome, by joining their assault. Instead, offering his horde supplies of food and granting the Cimbri free movement across their lands, the High King of the Cimbri considered there was no point into going to war against the local Celts, who themselves were oppressed by the Republic. After all, they were sending wagons of much-needed supplies to his tribe. However, they would not give him a critical thing he desperately needed in this alien land.
Intelligence.
About the topography, geography, or about the movements and positions of the Romans. He thought the past winter had been exceptionally harsh, and this spring had brought little relief as conditions had only marginally improved. His people were cold, hungry, and could use a rest in the pine-laden forests of northern Italy, while he dispatched squadrons of his excellent heavy cavalry to scout the land and bring him back information about the Roman army in the province that he knew he would have to exterminate. So he did so, while his people rested and recovered. When his patrols returned, he discovered that the Romans had not fled, but had instead retreated to a position just north of a river named Adige, which cut this area in half. He also received information that the lands just south, just beyond that river, were warm and bountiful. Thus he assembled his tribe, standing on a bloody sacrificial altar, as if to confirm all he was about to say was guaranteed by their gods. He told his people he knew they were exhausted, cold, and hungry, but rather than order them, he asked the Cimbri to follow him south to destroy the Roman army, and then they could all enjoy the bounty of this strange land, reminding them that all their gods had declared this to be their promised land, and the Cimbri roared. The next time we go deep, we will learn the fate of Lucius Cornelius Sulla and his small army, the fate of the battered and demoralized legions of Consul Catulus, and experience the genius of King Beorix, guided by his druids, as they seemingly unleash the powers of nature itself upon their enemies, which opens a window to that oh-so-rare occurrence, a plebeian commoner whose deeds burst through the mist of time through his actions in combat during a blinding blizzard near a town named Tridentum. The best and worst of Roman virtus will be on display as Catulus' legions face the most cunning and relentless barbarian assault in Rome's long storied history. When versus, the saga of how the Republic fell to the Empire continues in our next installment of the Cimbrian War. Thank you for listening to Deep into History. Tell everyone you know about the show. Please support me at patreon.com/deepintohistory. I could truly use your help to keep researching, writing these original scripts, and performing them for you. It's all I ever want to do.
That's patreon.com/deepintohistory.
So please help me realize that goal. You can follow me on social media at Deep Into History on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. Deep Into History is produced by the epically talented York Campbell of Poetic Earthling Studios, and the introduction is performed by Shante. And as always, my dear friend, take care of yourself and those around you. I truly look forward to the next time we go deep, deep, deep.
Today we'll be using a traditional wooden toboggan. Remember, when you make a run, to keep your hands and feet in at all times. Then let out a scream and don't be afraid to give her.